Dr. Marcus Chen's hands trembled as he stared at the medical certificate on his desk, the signature line waiting for his pen, the same tremor that had plagued him for 20 years, ever since the day he chose who lived and who died in the burning dust of Fallujah. The fluorescent lights of the VA hospital hummed overhead as Marcus tried to focus on the paperwork before him. Another veteran's death certificate. Another family's tragedy reduced to checkboxes and official stamps. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 2 decades trying to save lives, only to find himself surrounded by death once again. "Dr. Chen?" His assistant's voice cut through his thoughts. "Your 3 p.m. appointment is here. James Morrison, the journalist." Marcus's stomach clenched. Morrison had been calling for weeks, claiming to investigate irregularities in military death benefits. The last thing Marcus needed was a reporter digging into his past, especially now when everything was finally falling apart. Morrison entered the office with the predatory confidence of someone who knew he held all the cards. Mid-40s, sharp suit, recording device already in hand. "Dr. Chen, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be difficult." "I'm not sure how I can help you," Marcus replied, his voice carefully measured. "Patient confidentiality." "I'm not here about your patients." Morrison's smile was cold. "I'm here about Iraq, specifically October 15th, 2003. The day you made a choice that changed everything." The room seemed to spin. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. 20 years, and still that day could stop his heart. "I don't know what you're talking about." Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez and an 8-year-old Iraqi boy named Khalil al-Rashid. Ring any bells? The memories crashed over Marcus like a tsunami. The explosion, the screaming. Rodriguez bleeding out from shrapnel wounds while the child lay unconscious, skull fractured, blood pooling beneath his small body. Only enough medical supplies for one, only enough time for one. "You chose the boy," Morrison continued, watching Marcus's face carefully. "Rodriguez died. His family received the standard death benefit, 100-0. But here's where it gets interesting, Dr. Chen. That boy you saved, he grew up, became successful, very successful." Marcus's throat felt like sandpaper. What does this have to do with anything? Morrison pulled out a tablet, swiping to a photograph. "Meet Dr. Khalil al-Rashid, now a prominent neurosurgeon in Detroit, worth approximately $2.3 million. And guess who's been his personal physician for the past 5 years?" The world tilted. Marcus stared at the photo, the same dark eyes he'd looked into as he made his impossible choice. Now older, successful, alive because of a decision made in a split second of chaos. "Khalil has been very generous to you, hasn't he, Dr. Chen? Anonymous donations to your medical practice, funding for your research, that new house in Marin County, all coming from offshore accounts traced back to his medical corporation. It's not what you think." And then there's Rodriguez's family. His widow, Maria, struggling to raise 3 kids on a teacher's salary. His parents, who lost their home in 2008. Meanwhile, you've been living quite comfortably on money from the man whose life you chose over their sons. Marcus felt the walls closing in. "Khalil doesn't know. He has no idea who I am, what happened." "Doesn't he?" Morrison's grin widened. "That's where you're wrong, Doctor. See, I've been investigating something much bigger than your personal guilt complex. I've been tracking systematic fraud in military death benefits, families being shortchanged, money being redirected, medical records being falsified." The journalist leaned forward. 17 families, Dr. Chen. 17 military families who were told their sons and daughters died from combat injuries when the medical records show something entirely different. And guess whose signature is on every single death certificate? Marcus's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. "That's impossible. I haven't falsified anything." "Haven't you? Let me refresh your memory." Morrison pulled out a stack of files. "Private Sarah Cheno relation. I assume officially died from IED injuries. But your own medical notes indicate she was stable, expected to recover. Death occurred 12 hours after you signed off on her care. Cause of death? Medical error. Specifically, contaminated blood supply." The room was spinning faster now. Marcus recognized the name, remembered the case. A clerical error had led to Sarah receiving the wrong blood type. She died from complications that were entirely preventable, but the military had wanted to classify it as combat-related to preserve their safety record and ensure maximum benefits for the family. Private Jennifer Walsh, officially killed by sniper fire, actually died from a severe allergic reaction to medication you prescribed. Private David Kim, listed as dying from roadside bomb injuries, actually died from post-operative complications after you operated while intoxicated. Each name was a hammer blow. Marcus remembered them all: the mistakes, the cover-ups, the constant pressure from military leadership to keep casualty reports clean. He'd convinced himself he was protecting the families, ensuring they received full benefits. But now, seeing it laid out like this, 17 families received full combat death benefits totaling $1.7 million. Morrison continued. Money that should have gone to wrongful death settlements, malpractice claims, medical review boards. Instead, it was quietly distributed as combat pay, with a substantial portion being redirected through various medical contractors and consulting fees, money that eventually found its way to you. "I never took money for falsifying records," Marcus whispered, but even as he said it, he could see the web Morrison had woven. The consulting fees, the research grants, the anonymous donations, all of it connected to military medical contractors who benefited from keeping malpractice settlements low. The beautiful thing about guilt, Dr. Chen, is how it makes people rationalize anything. You convinced yourself you were being generous, helping families, healing wounds, but you were really just covering your tracks and getting paid for it. Morrison stood, straightening his jacket. "Oh, and about Dr. Al-Rashid. He knows exactly who you are. Has known for years. Those anonymous donations? They weren't gratitude, doctor. They were blackmail." The floor dropped out from under Marcus. "What?" "Khalil al-Rashid has been funding your comfortable lifestyle because he knows about Rodriguez. He knows you chose him over an American soldier, and he knows how that would look to certain people, especially people investigating medical fraud in military operations." Morrison moved toward the door. "See, here's the thing about choices, Dr. Chen. The one you made in Iraq, that wasn't the real crime. The real crime was everything you did afterward to justify it. Every record you falsified, every family you lied to, every dollar you took, all to avoid facing the fact that sometimes there are no right choices." As the journalist reached for the door handle, Marcus found his voice. "What do you want?" "I want the truth. About the 17 families, about the medical contractors, about the systematic fraud that's been going on for 20 years. Morrison paused. "You have 48 hours to decide whether you're going to be a whistleblower or a defendant." The door clicked shut, leaving Marcus alone with his trembling hands and the weight of 20 years of carefully constructed lies. He looked at the unsigned death certificate on his desk. Another veteran, another family, another chance to do the right thing or perpetuate the system that had consumed his life. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Dr. Chen, we need to talk. The journalist found me too. K. Al-Rashid." Marcus's heart hammered as he realized Morrison's final deception. Khalil hadn't been blackmailing him. The money, the donations, the support had all been genuine gratitude from a man who'd spent 20 years building a successful life because of Marcus's impossible choice. But that choice had set in motion a chain of events that led Marcus down a path of corruption and fraud. In trying to live with the guilt of choosing one life over another, he'd compromised countless others. The next morning, Marcus sat in a federal courthouse, surrounded by FBI agents and federal prosecutors. 17 families filled the gallery behind him: mothers, fathers, siblings of soldiers whose deaths had been misclassified to hide medical malpractice and fund a systematic fraud scheme. Maria Rodriguez was there too, older now, gray-haired, but with the same fierce eyes her husband had possessed. She watched as Marcus was sworn in, as he began to detail 20 years of falsified records, diverted funds, and covered-up mistakes. The system was designed to protect military medical personnel from malpractice claims, Marcus testified, his voice steady for the first time in decades. Deaths were reclassified as combat, related to avoid scrutiny and maximize family benefits. But the money saved on legal settlements was redirected to contractors, administrators, and medical personnel who participated in the cover-up. As he spoke, Marcus caught sight of Khalil al-Rashid in the back of the courtroom. The man he'd saved was watching him with something that might have been respect, or perhaps just recognition of another impossible choice being made. Dr. Chen, the prosecutor asked, "In your professional opinion, how many military families have been affected by this fraud?" Marcus looked at the faces in the gallery, the families whose loved ones had died from preventable medical errors, whose grief had been compounded by lies and cover-ups. Based on my review of records dating back to 2003, I estimate over 200 cases across multiple military medical facilities. The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Family members wept or shouted. But Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: relief. That evening, as he sat in his hotel room awaiting sentencing, Marcus received a visitor. Khalil al-Rashid stood in the doorway, older now but unmistakably the same person whose life Marcus had chosen to save. "You don't remember me, do you?" Khalil said quietly. "From Iraq." Marcus studied his face. "I remember a child, unconscious, bleeding." "I remember you," Khalil replied. "Not clearly. I was 8, traumatized. But I remember your hands, the way you worked, the choice you made." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Khalil spoke again. "I became a doctor because of that day, because I saw what it meant to save a life. I've dedicated my career to pediatric neurosurgery, to saving children like I was saved." "Rodriguez had a family," Marcus said. "Children who needed their father." "Yes, and I've spent 20 years wondering about that soldier, about his family. When I learned who you were, I wanted to help. The donations weren't guilt money, Dr. Chen. They were gratitude from one doctor to another." Khalil stood to leave, then turned back. "What you did today, testifying against the system that took courage, Rodriguez's family will finally know the truth about what happened. That's worth something." After Khalil left, Marcus sat alone with his thoughts. Tomorrow he would likely face years in prison for his role in the fraud scheme. His medical license would be revoked, his reputation destroyed. But for the first time since that dusty day in Fallujah, he felt like he could breathe. The choice he'd made in Iraq saving Khalil over Rodriguez hadn't been wrong. It had been impossible, the kind of decision that tears at the soul regardless of the outcome. But everything that came after, the lies and cover-ups and rationalization, had been a choice too. A choice to protect himself rather than face the truth. As Marcus prepared for bed, he thought about the 17 families in the courtroom today. Tomorrow, federal investigators would begin reviewing thousands of military medical records, looking for patterns of fraud and misclassification. Families would finally learn the truth about their loved ones' deaths. Some would receive compensation for decades of deception. It wouldn't bring back Rodriguez or any of the other soldiers who died from preventable medical errors. But it might prevent future families from being lied to, future medical personnel from being corrupted by a system that prioritized image over truth. Marcus's hands were steady as he turned off the lights. The tremor that had plagued him for 20 years was finally gone. The next morning brought news that stunned even the federal prosecutors. Khalil al-Rashid held a press conference announcing the establishment of the Rodriguez Foundation, a $10 million endowment to provide scholarships for children of military personnel who died from medical malpractice. The foundation would be funded entirely by al-Rashid's assets, the fortune he'd built as a neurosurgeon, the life he'd been able to live because of Marcus's choice. 20 years ago, an American combat medic saved my life, Khalil announced to the gathered media. Yesterday, that same man saved the honor of countless military families by choosing truth over self-preservation. This foundation honors both the life I was given and the life that was lost so I could live. Marcus watched the press conference from his holding cell, understanding finally that some choices echo through decades in ways impossible to predict. The decision he'd made in a moment of chaos, had created ripples that touched hundreds of lives, some for better, some for worse, all part of a complex web of consequence and moral ambiguity. The federal judge sentenced Marcus to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 5. His cooperation in exposing the fraud scheme and his testimony that led to the conviction of 12 other medical personnel and administrators were considered in his favor. As he was led away in handcuffs, Marcus passed Maria Rodriguez in the courthouse hallway. She stopped him with a look that contained 20 years of grief and anger, but also something else. "My Tommy was a good soldier," she said quietly. "He deserved better than lies." "Yes, ma'am, he did," Marcus replied. "I'm sorry it took so long to tell the truth." Maria nodded once, then walked away. It wasn't forgiveness. Marcus knew he didn't deserve that. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that some measure of justice had finally been served. In his cell that night, Marcus received a letter from Khalil. Inside was a photograph, a young Iraqi boy in a hospital bed, bandages around his head, eyes closed but breathing. On the back, someone had written in Arabic and English, "Life is sacred, all life." Marcus understood then that the choice he'd made in Iraq hadn't been about American versus Iraqi, soldier versus civilian, us versus them. It had been about life versus death. And in that moment, facing an impossible decision with inadequate resources and no good options, he'd chosen life. Everything that came after the guilt, the rationalization, the gradual descent into fraud and deception had been him losing sight of that simple truth. In trying to justify his choice, he'd betrayed the very principle that had guided it. 5 years later, Marcus was released on parole. The world had changed. The Iraq War was a memory. New conflicts had taken its place, and military medical protocols had been completely overhauled following the congressional investigation his testimony had triggered. He found work at a free clinic in East Oakland, treating undocumented immigrants and homeless veterans. The pay was minimal, the conditions challenging, but the work felt clean in a way nothing had for 20 years. One afternoon, a young woman brought her injured son to the clinic. The boy had fallen from his bicycle, suffered a head injury. As Marcus examined him, checking for signs of concussion, the mother asked in accented English, "Doctor, will he be okay?" Marcus looked into her worried eyes and saw every parent who'd ever trusted him with their child's life. "I'll do everything I can," he promised, and meant it completely. The boy recovered fully. As they prepared to leave, the mother pressed something into Marcus's hand, a small prayer card with Arabic writing. "For saving my son," she said. Marcus waited until they were gone before looking at the card. On one side was Arabic text. On the other, English translation, "Whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved all of mankind." That evening, Marcus called the number he'd memorized but never dialed. Khalil al-Rashid answered on the second ring. "Dr. Chen, I wondered if you'd ever call." "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, "for the foundation, for understanding." "We both know the weight of that day," Khalil replied. "But we also both know that weight doesn't have to crush us. We can carry it, learn from it, use it to do better." They talked for an hour, two doctors shaped by an impossible choice, finding their way towards something resembling peace. When Marcus hung up, he felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally been shared. The next morning brought devastating news. James Morrison, the journalist whose investigation had exposed the fraud scheme, was found dead in his hotel room. Initial reports suggested suicide, a single gunshot wound, no signs of struggle, a note left behind claiming guilt over ruining innocent lives. But Marcus knew better. Morrison had been working on a follow-up story, investigating who had ordered the systematic fraud, which high-ranking officials had known about the cover-ups. His death was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. At Morrison's funeral, Marcus met with FBI agents who shared his suspicions. The investigation into military medical fraud had reached the highest levels of the Pentagon, implicating generals and civilian administrators who'd built careers on maintaining pristine casualty statistics. Morrison was getting close to something big. Agent Sarah Collins explained. His laptop was wiped, his files destroyed. but we found backup drives hidden in his apartment. The story goes deeper than we thought. The backup drives contained evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back decades: systematic falsification of military casualty reports, manipulation of death benefits, and elimination of whistleblowers who threatened to expose the truth. Morrison had identified at least 40 suspicious deaths of military medical personnel, journalists, and government investigators over a 20-year period. Marcus found himself once again at the center of a federal investigation, this time as a protected witness rather than a defendant. The prosecution of high-ranking military officials required testimony from someone with insider knowledge of how the fraud system operated. The trials that followed made national headlines. 3 generals, 12 civilian administrators, and dozens of medical personnel were convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and in some cases, accessory to murder. The scandal led to the resignation of the Secretary of Defense and comprehensive reform of military medical oversight. Throughout the proceedings, Marcus was haunted by a terrible realization. Morrison's investigation had begun with the choice Marcus made in Iraq, but the conspiracy it uncovered had been using that choice and choices like it justify decades of systematic corruption. The impossible decision between Rodriguez and Khalil hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a calculated system designed to put medical personnel in positions where they would be forced to make difficult choices, then use those choices to manipulate and control them. They knew, Marcus testified before a congressional committee, the system was designed to create moral injury, to compromise medical personnel psychologically so they could be controlled. Every impossible choice, every life or death decision we were forced to make, became leverage they could use against us. The committee's final report concluded that over 200 military families had been deceived about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, with fraud totaling over $50 million in diverted benefits and settlements. More importantly, the report documented how psychological manipulation of military medical personnel had been used as a tool of institutional control, turning doctors and medics into unwilling participants in systematic deception. As Marcus read the report's conclusions, he understood finally that his story wasn't unique. Across the military medical system, personnel had been placed in impossible situations, forced to make choices that would haunt them, then manipulated into silence through guilt and complicity. The 20 years he'd spent believing he was uniquely guilty, uniquely compromised, had been based on a lie. He was one of hundreds who'd been systematically manipulated into betraying their own moral principles. 6 months after the congressional hearings concluded, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at the free clinic. Maria Rodriguez stood in the doorway, older but still carrying herself with military bearing. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Marcus said, surprised. "How did you find me?" "Dr. Al-Rashid gave me your address. I hope that's okay." She looked around the modest clinic, taking in the worn furniture and peeling paint. "This is where you work now?" "Yes, ma'am. It's honest work." Maria nodded approvingly. Tommy would have liked that. He always said the best medicine happens where people need it most, not where they can afford it most. She sat across from Marcus's desk, the same desk where James Morrison had confronted him years earlier. "I want you to know something, Dr. Chen. I don't forgive you for the lies, for the cover-up. That hurt my family in ways I can't describe." Marcus nodded, accepting her words without defense. "But," Maria continued, "I understand now that you were as much a victim of the system as Tommy was. Maybe more because you had to live with what they made you do." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph of Rodriguez in his dress uniform, young and smiling. "This is how I want to remember him. Not as a victim of conspiracy or cover-up, but as a good man who served his country with honor." Maria placed the photograph on Marcus's desk. The foundation Dr. Al-Rashid created in Tommy's name has helped over 200 military families. Children are getting educations, going to college, becoming doctors and teachers and engineers. Tommy's death wasn't meaningless if it led to that. As she stood to leave, Maria turned back one last time. "The choice you made in Iraq saving that boy over my husband, I can't say it was right or wrong. But what came after? The truth-telling, the standing up to the system that destroyed so many lives. Tommy would have respected that. After she left, Marcus sat staring at Rodriguez's photograph, understanding finally that redemption isn't about erasing past mistakes, but about finding the courage to face truth and work toward justice, even when it costs everything. That evening, Marcus called Khalil one last time. "I wanted you to know," he said. "I'm retiring from medicine. The clinic is training a replacement. I think it's time." "What will you do?" Khalil asked. "I'm going to write," Marcus replied. "Tell the whole story. Not just about us, about that day in Iraq, but about everything that came after. The system, the manipulation, the way they used our choices against us." "That could be dangerous," Khalil warned. "Look what happened to Morrison." "Maybe, but I think I've been afraid long enough." Marcus's book, The Weight of Choice, A Combat Medic's Journey from Honor to Fraud to Redemption, was published 2 years later. It became a bestseller, not for its sensational revelations, but for its unflinching examination of how institutional corruption can transform moral injury into systematic deception. The book's final chapter was dedicated to Rodriguez, Khalil, Morrison, and the hundreds of military families affected by the fraud conspiracy. But its last lines were about choice itself. "In Fallujah, faced with 2 dying people and resources to save only one, I made an impossible choice in seconds. I spent 20 years believing that choice defined me, let guilt over it corrupt everything that followed. But the real choice, the one that actually mattered, wasn't made in a moment of chaos. It was made every day afterward, in every decision to tell the truth or perpetuate a lie, to seek justice or accept comfortable corruption. We all face impossible choices. The measure of our character isn't found in those desperate moments, but in how we choose to live with their consequences." The book's publication triggered another wave of investigations, leading to additional prosecutions and reforms. More importantly, it sparked a national conversation about moral injury, institutional corruption, and the true cost of military service. Marcus donated all proceeds from the book to veterans' mental health programs and the Rodriguez Foundation. He spent his remaining years speaking at military medical schools, teaching young doctors and medics about the ethical challenges they would face and the importance of maintaining moral clarity even in impossible situations. He died peacefully at age 74, surrounded by friends and colleagues who remembered him not as the man who'd made an impossible choice in Iraq, but as the one who'd found the courage to expose systematic corruption and fight for truth. At his funeral, Khalil al-Rashid delivered the eulogy. Standing before a congregation that included Maria Rodriguez, surviving members of the 17 families affected by the fraud, FBI agents who'd worked the investigation, and dozens of veterans Marcus had treated at the free clinic, Khalil spoke about the ripple effects of choice and the possibility of redemption. "Marcus Chen saved my life in Iraq," Khalil said. "But he saved something more important than that over the years that followed. He saved the truth. He saved justice for families who'd been lied to for decades. He saved the honor of military medicine by exposing the corruption that had infected it. The choice he made in Fallujah wasn't heroic or villainous. It was human. Faced with impossible circumstances, he chose life. Everything that followed the guilt, the compromise, the eventual courage to tell the truth was also human. Marcus taught us that we are not defined by our worst moments or our desperate choices, but by our willingness to face the truth and fight for what's right, even when it costs us everything." As mourners filed past Marcus's casket, Maria Rodriguez paused to place something beside the flower-saw small American flag, the same one that had draped her husband's coffin 25 years earlier. On it, she'd pinned a simple note, "For 2 good men who served with honor." In the weeks following the funeral, Khalil established one final memorial, the Chen Rodriguez Institute for Military Medical Ethics, dedicated to training military medical personnel to recognize and resist institutional pressure to compromise their moral principles. The Institute's motto, carved in stone above its entrance, came from Marcus's book. "In impossible choices, choose truth. In desperate moments, choose courage." in all things, choose to serve life. But the real monument to Marcus Chen wasn't institutional or architectural. It was found in the hundreds of military families who finally knew the truth about their loved ones' deaths, in the reformed medical oversight systems that prevented future fraud, in the young doctors and medics who learned to maintain their integrity even under impossible pressure. And perhaps most importantly, it was found in the understanding that moral injury, the wound that comes from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate deeply held moral beliefs, doesn't have to be permanent. With courage, truth, and the support of others who understand the weight of impossible choices, even the deepest moral wounds can heal. 27 years after that dusty day in Fallujah, the ripples from Marcus Chen's impossible choice were still spreading. A saved life had become a celebrated neurosurgeon. An exposed fraud had reformed military medicine. A moment of moral clarity had inspired thousands to choose truth over comfortable lies. The choice between Rodriguez and Khalil had seemed impossible because there was no right answer, no perfect solution. But the choices that followed, the daily decisions to live with integrity or compromise it, to serve truth or betray it, to heal or perpetuate harm, those choices were possible, and they were what ultimately mattered. In his private papers, discovered after his death, Marcus had written one final reflection on the events that shaped his life. "I thought the hardest choice I'd ever make was in that dusty street in Iraq, deciding between two lives when I could only save one. But the hardest choice was actually much simpler and much more difficult, choosing every single day to be the person I wanted to be rather than the person my guilt told me I was."